Okay, so our last video was a quick introduction to the peripheral nervous system. So now we're going to look at its general organization. Now, to remind yourself what the somatosensory system is, it's the part of the sensory system that serves the body wall and the limbs. It's the part that receives input from exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, and interoreceptors, or essentially receptors of the body. It's then able to transmit this information about several different sensory modalities to decide essentially on an output. But that somatosensory system in the cortex of the brain will send this information to those association areas. So it's really kind of a communication between the somatosensory area and the receptors of the body that allow the sensory cortices of the brain to work. Now, the input that comes from exteroreceptors is a stimulus that arises outside of the body. Think ears and eyes. If there's an input that comes from proprioceptors, that is information that's arising from position of the body changing, or information about stretch or pressure at muscles, joints, tendons, even information coming from the inner ear. And with interoreceptors, that's going to be stimuli coming in as an input in response to kind of changes within the body, like is your bladder full or your stomach full? So it's that type of information that's sent as a sensory input, but then goes from that receptor level, from circuit level, to the perceptual level. So it arises or makes it to the cortical sensory areas. So that is kind of the overview of the somatosensory circuit. We start with a stimulus that is picked up by a sensory receptor. Then that processing is going to be utilized via ascending pathways. Ascending pathways utilize first, second, and third order neurons, and it's the third order neuron that is going to synapse in the cerebrum. So that sensory information is generally relayed towards the head or towards the central nervous system, but it can also be processed along the way. So let's look closer at the receptor level. So for a sensation to occur, we need a stimulus. It has to excite a receptor, and that has to create a graded potential that leads to an action potential, and those action potentials have to be carried through a series of neurons to reach the central nervous system. So that stimulus energy must not only make it to the central nervous system, it has to first be specific to the receptor in the area where the stimulus occurs. For example, a touch receptor can only pick up on mechanical pressure, stretch, and vibration, not bright light. The stimulus energy also needs to be applied within an area where the receptor is. And so that's called the receptive field. That's the area the receptor monitors. And then if you have the right receptor and the stimulus in the right area, then you still need that stimulus energy to be converted into a graded potential and initiate transduction that might cause an action potential. So there's quite a bit that goes on at the receptor level. And receptors can produce one of two types of graded potentials. General sense receptors can produce generator potentials in the afferent neuron that then lead to an action potential. That generator potential is just a graded potential. Now, if it's a special sense organ, then the graded potential initially is a receptor potential because it occurs in the receptor cell. And then that would lead to neurotransmitter release by the receptor cell that then initiates a graded potential in the afferent sensory neuron. Then you finally get an action potential if that graded potential is strong enough. So not only do we need specificity, we need proper receptive field use and a graded potential that gives us threshold that leads to an action potential. We need all of that for a receptor to communicate to the circuit level. So to review, the receptor level is sensory receptors. Circuit level is processing using the ascending pathways, so first, second, and third order neurons. And perceptual level is what we looked at with the central nervous system, those processes that occur in cortical sensory areas. So that's kind of a quick review of the somatosensory system, and it's more than just that somatosensory cortex. Alright, let's talk more now about the circuit level. For ascending pathways, which carry sensory information, there are three orders of neurons: a first, second, and third order neurons. The first order neuron will conduct the impulse from the receptor to the second order neuron. The second order neuron will transmit the impulse to the third order neuron, and the third order neuron will conduct the impulse from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex. So it actually reaches the brain, and we start to see processing at the perceptual level. There's also some adaptation to sensory receptors. Some are fast adapting and phasic. Others, they have a sustained response and no adaptation. Like nociceptors or proprioceptors, so those pain receptors or those receptors that let you know where you are in space, they're tonic. They have no adaptation because we wouldn't want to get used to pain or think our body was in a different area or be confused about that. So an adaptation that occurs is when a sensory receptor is subjected to a changing stimulus, like stepping into bright light. So for example, receptors responding to pressure, touch, and smell are going to adapt phasically. And then receptors like proprioceptors and nociceptors are tonic because they do not exhibit adaptation. And then finally, let's finish talking about the somatosensory system with the perceptual level. That's the sensory input reaching the cerebral cortex. And for that, there's 6 major features of sensory perception. Perceptual detection, basically just letting us know that a stimulus has occurred, is that raw data arriving at the cerebrum. Magnitude estimation, so that's letting us know how intense a stimulus is, and that's going to be detailed by action potential frequency coding. Spatial discrimination, that's identifying the site of the stimulus, so its receptor field. Feature abstraction, specific texture or shape. And quality discrimination kind of goes with feature abstraction, and that's helping identify submodalities like not just texture and shape, but also flavors. And pattern recognition helps us recognize something like a melody or a familiar face because it's the ability to recognize patterns. Alright, now that we've talked about the different parts of the somatosensory system, next we can look at different ways to talk about sensory receptors. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video, so make sure to watch that one.